Hello everyone. Thank you for joining me today to go over my disaster project for Safety Management 533. For my project, I chose Grenfell Tower Fire. Happened just a few years ago in 2017, London. Technical difficulties here. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. Here's the abstract. On the day of June 14th, 2017, a major incident was declared by the London Fire Brigade. Grenfell Tower was ablaze, and it took over 20 hours to put out. This tower stood at 24 floors and functioned as a residential complex in North Kensington, London, England. It housed over 200 bedrooms and a few offices on the lower floors. Concerns had been raised about the fire hazards on site, but nothing had been done. That night, the cladding on the outside of the building caught fire due to a small refrigerator fire that began on the 4th floor. Once it reached the outside of the window, there was no return. Fire measures were ignored, and the emergency response was not prepared for an incident such as this. Many died and many were injured. So from the abstract, we also said the housing complex, it stood at 24 stories. By the end of the disaster, we totaled 72 deaths. Greater than 70 were injured. Luckily, 223 escaped. So here we've got a time frame, kind of a sequence of events from the beginning of the fire to the end. So we'll review these to kind of give you a picture of how things went down. So here at 12:50 a.m., that is when the original fridge-freezer combo started. That was on the 4th floor, so plenty of room to burn. At 0:54, the London Fire Brigade was called. And then 6 minutes later, the first 2 fire engines arrived. That's an important thing to note. Only 2 fire engines were called at the initial. At 1:07, the flat 16 was entered by the London Fire Brigade, and by that time the fire had already breached the window. At 1:13, incident commander calls for 2 more engines and an aerial appliance. 1:15, a couple minutes later, flat 26 directly above was starting to fill with smoke. At this point, it was starting to get serious. At 1:30, the fire reaches the roof. So picture that. From the 4th floor, it only took 40 minutes to reach the roof. That kind of tells you how flammable that cladding was on the outside. At 1:35, an additional 25 fire engines, 2 aerial platforms, multiple fire rescue units, damage control, bulk breathing apparatus, and police. At 1:40, stairwell and lobbies were filled with smoke, making it very difficult for firefighters to rescue and for the occupants to escape. At 2, it wasn't until 2 that a major incident was declared. It seems kind of like a while for me, but that was when it was put on paper. The fire engines were increased to 40, 10 rescue units, 6 command vehicles, 4 aerial platforms now, and 2 operation support units. At 2:47, the stay put policy was abandoned. Again, it took a lot longer than expected. General evacuation was then put in place to allow the residents to leave and do their best to escape the burning complex. At 4:44, the complete building was surrounded by fire. And at 8:07, the last rescue was made. Here is the aftermath, and you can see the building is completely charred. Not much left of it. It's still standing there today. So, and here's a picture kind of to go and correspond with our sequence of events. Remember at 12:50, that is when the fire started, and here is 40 minutes later. So fourth floor's somewhere down in here. 40 minutes later, the fire had already reached the top. At 2:10, you can see it starting to spread, excuse me, multiple floors in a horizontal direction, now and not just vertical. As it continues here, spreading further around the side, it looks like at 3:08, the entire building is beginning to be consumed. 3:23, this whole side over here is completely lit. 3:44, still burning good. 4:20. Then at 5:16, towards the end, is finally when you start to see a little bit more smoke and less flame. So here we're going to look at the emergency response and the pre-planned failures. This is kind of the bulk of the report here. So, as we saw from the sequence of events, it only took 40 minutes for the flames to reach the roof. On the next slide, we're going to go into some more detail about the choice of cladding, and we're going to kind of hit all of these topics here a little bit harder on their own individual slides. But to point out the initial failures, the aerial platform was dispatched much too late. We had sprinklers, should have been in each room, however they weren't. It wasn't mandated by the city. Stairwell and lobbies filled with smoke due to inadequate fire doors. Lifts and elevators unfit for evacuation. The stay put policy relies on the assumption the building defense mechanisms will contain to one flat. If we look at these 3 or 4 different variables here, we see that the defense mechanisms were not proper. We had high traffic on the radio comms. We saw how many engines were getting brought on site. Just about every 20 minutes it seemed like they were asking for more. Small breathing apparatuses. It wasn't till late that they actually brought continuous breathing tanks, and they started with the 30 minutes tanks, SCBAs, and then finally they ignored warnings from residents. So now we'll go into these each a little further. So the primary cause was the cladding. We've been talking about that a bit so far. Once the fire reached the outside of the building, it's pretty much game over. The sheet cladding was chosen for its cost effectiveness. Compared to the pricier flame retardant version. Behind the cladding was an even more flammable polyisocyanurate insulation. The whole side of the building was on fire. A resident said the cladding went up like a matchstick. So here we've got a graphic. We can see that the aluminum panels kind of surrounds the polyisocyanurate material that was extremely flammable. This cladding runs up along the outside of the building, and there's actually a space of air in between that, which does not help our cause at all. The fire bursts through the window. It catches that cladding on fire, kind of once that aluminum panel starts to fade, core was exposed and basically just let the fire travel all the way up to the roof. The exposed core ignites much faster than the intact panels. The fire accelerated to the nearby panels, so flames kept racing through. And the worst part about this was, now that the fire is traveling up the room, once those windows break to the flats, now the fire is traveling inside the individual rooms, causing that smoke to fill up on every single floor. The cladding was the primary cause for this fire to accelerate as fast as it did. So here, the aerial platforms. They were dispatched much too late. The fire spread to the top floor by the time it arrived. We saw that there was 2 engines called at the beginning of the fire and no aerial platforms. The one that we had on site was only able to reach the 10th floor, but if we were able to have that there at the initial call, this fire could have been prevented, I believe. So at the instance of this call, it should have been dispatched immediately. I think aerial lift should be required within a certain distance of high-rise facilities, and they should extend the height of the tallest building within that vicinity. And high-rises, fires should just require an automatic dispatch. Hindsight is 2020, but you would think that's kind of basic precaution to send an aerial lift to a high-rise fire. Unfortunately, it was not, and we've seen the results. Sprinklers were not mandated in this sort of building. The expense behind this project would have been well worth the original investment. This is the case for many of the failures in this incident. The summer of 2017 saw a number of deadly high-rise fires, including Grenfell fire and the Marco Polo fire. While deadly incidents like these are usually the result of a combination of failures, these buildings had one major thing in common. And that was that they did not contain sprinkler units throughout them. So these events, Marco and Grenfell, both led to a review of high-rise sprinkler requirements for the 2021 edition of the NFPA Fire Code 1. The fire code is intended to address firefighter life safety and building protection, in addition to occupant life safety. The high-rise building sprinkler requirements are straightforward. All new high-rise buildings must be protected with sprinklers throughout, and all existing high-rise buildings must be sprinklered within 12 years of the adoption of the code. Next, we'll talk about the inadequate fire doors. The doors used in Grenfell were not the same tested by the manufacturer, and they did not pass the smoke standard. Hardware differed from what was supposed to be sold. Non-functioning doors led to smoke travel throughout the lobbies and stairwells. Smoke inhalation can kill within a few short minutes. We know this, and the upper floors here are at an extreme disadvantage. So that smoke test, it's a standard known as FD30S, and that's just fire door 30 minutes, which did not have the smoke pass rating. So I'm not really sure why the FD30 door was delivered, but the FD30S was not installed. So that was some poor decision making by the landlord or safety engineers there. lifts and elevators. In most cases, taking the stairs is going to be your best route of escape, but for those with mobility issues, the lifts may be your only option, depending on their condition. NFPA has a set of requirements for elevators listed in section 7.14. Where elevators are used for occupants' egress, the elevator shall not count as one of the required means of egress. It shall not be included in determining the capacity of the means of egress, and it shall not be used to satisfy the arrangement of egress requirements. These lifts should also have an additional power source so it can operate during a fire. The one at Grenfell excuse me, was not in condition to operate the night of the fire. So it's not necessary, but additional means of egress can be beneficial in many cases. Stay put policy. Residents were told to stay put even after multiple floors were on fire. Notices were actually placed March 2017 to stay put unless directly affecting a flat. It took over 2 hours to move to general evacuation. Stay put works when other measures are accounted for, such as the doors, the sprinklers, etc. The preceding slide will show that this policy was ineffective for Grenfell. And here's a typical stay put policy that was similar to the one placed at Grenfell. So there is a stay put policy for residents unless the fire is in or affecting your flat. If you discover a fire in your flat or block, leave at once, shutting the doors behind you. Leave the building by the nearest and safest route. Telephone the fire brigade. If you are safely within your flat and there's a fire elsewhere in the block, you should initially be safe to stay in your flat, keeping the doors and windows closed. On arrival, the fire brigade will make an assessment and will assist with evacuation if required. If you wish to evacuate, leave closing the door behind you and exit the building. If you are in a communal area and become aware of a fire, leave the building at once and alert the fire brigade. If leaving the building, please do not use lifts. Do not re-enter the building until instructed to do so. Your assembly point is outside of the front block, so depending on where that's placed, you'd have a different assembly point. But this is the exact one actually by the KCTMO organization that managed this flat. The radio communications. This was another big issue. I'm sure we all can remember an instance where communication was poor in the workplace. So now try to picture yourself in a 24-story housing complex that's burning over 1,000 degrees. Not the situation that you want to be in. So they had issues with the radios penetrating over 10 floors of concrete. There was too many on one channel to efficiently communicate. And poor communication for an incident like this just creates an extreme hazard. The breathing apparatus. So originally the firefighters showed up with these 30-minute air tanks, and sometimes 15 depending on if they had them filled or not. Tanks go much quicker during an extreme situation, so there wasn't enough air to make it up to the top of the higher rise floors, and then actually, they could get up, but they weren't able to get back down with enough oxygen. So that kind of left the higher floors impossible to save. So I had the opportunity to participate in a hazmat and fire training at a local refinery, and most of these tanks are rated for at least 30 minutes. However, it's different for everyone depending on the shape you're in. Most of the firemen are trained to make every breath count, but during an extreme incident such as this, where stress is high, they get used up quick. So the ignored warnings. Despite the recent fire at Shepherd's Bush, we also talked about the Marco Polo no actions were taken. KCTMO was aware of the blog created by Ed Daffron here, a resident, but ignored. KCTMO is led by Robert Black. We'll go into that a little bit further later. Safety petitions were posed back in 2010, 2013, 2015, and 2017. And for some reason or another, they still chose to ignore the warnings. So we'll kind of take a look at the overall response evaluation here. So the original call, it wasn't descriptive enough for the true destruction that was about to begin. We saw that only 2 engines were called, and that may seem right for a small flat fire, a refrigerator fire, but the department was unaware of the cladding that was on the outside. So this should have been reviewed by a safety engineer, not for cost effectiveness, that's left to the finance guys, but for a safety perspective, you would think that somebody would have looked over that cladding and seen that it was extremely flammable. The aerial ladder should have been called on first attendance. They should be dispatched immediately on the event of a high-rise fire. You'd think that would be common sense, just if the fire was to spread, but most of these buildings are meant to contain the fire within a flat. The sprinklers, they're not mandatory, but should have been considered, I think. So it seemed like these guys were taking the cost-effective measures, and if it's not mandatory, then they weren't going to put it in. Now the NFPA is making sure this is going to be included in high-rise buildings, which I'll fill in some more on the next slide as well. Cheaper doors seems like to be a common theme with the KCTMO group. They were installed, and I think they were actually ordered the correct doors, but they were given a cheaper option, and those were installed. So somebody should have followed up. It should have been another job for the engineer, safety engineer on site, to make sure that these doors were rated. So the stay put policy, this one kind of hurts me the most. If all parts of the equation were in order, like the doors, the cladding, the sprinklers, etc., were in order, this policy would have been just fine. However, the landlord housed their occupants in a fire trap and told them to stay put. There was absolutely no planning whatsoever for the safety of the occupants, and it's extremely sad to see the outcome of that failure. The general evacuation policy should have been in place at the event of any fire, since other precautions were not taken. Kind of to make matters even worse, the response team was not able to communicate effectively through the thick layers of concrete. Not to mention the hundreds of people on the station, all shouting, screaming during this stressful event. This type of emergency needs to be planned for, and rescue teams need to separate onto individual comms with reports back to manager, similar to what we learned in our incident command structure during the modules. The last evaluation to include were the choice of supplied breathing apparatuses. The larger 45-minute or 60-minute tanks would have performed much better during this incident. Unfortunately, the original call, they only brought the 30-minute tanks. So long-term response. The London Fire Brigade is making efforts to procure an aerial platform that will reach at least 67 meters. That was good to hear. We've got new buildings over 30 meters tall are now required to have a sprinkler system. there is a ban on combustible materials on residential buildings over 18 meters tall. So that's referring to the cladding on the outside. We've got open investigations still. I mean, this event was very recent. Under civil, manslaughter, neglect, fraudulent claims, insurance, etc. List goes on. And the Metropolitan Police said the largest and most complex investigation they've had, and they've asked for $38 million to assist them with that. Chancellor Philip Hammond provided $28 million to help the victims. The Housing Secretary, James Brokenshire, stated $200 million would be provided to replace cladding on private blocks. It was originally to be the owner's cost, but that was revised in May, so I was happy to see that they were looking after their citizens. So we'll look over the organization description here. So I've listed the primary organization as KCTMO. That's Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organization at fault, because in the end they made the decisions that affected its residents the most. KCTMO was the largest tenant management organization in England. They managed over 10,000 properties, and this organization was actually managed on behalf of one of London's local political authorities. So due to the inability to cope with Grenfell, many of its members resigned. However, they were dismissed of providing relief for Grenfell's victims. Shortly after the incident, KCTMO stated it would be relieving its duty of housing back to the council since they had lost their tenants' trust. I mentioned a secondary organization, and there probably could have been a few more, as Arconic. They should have forgone selling that material to a housing complex, such as Grenfell. I mean, it is business, and it would be hard to say no to a job that big. I'm sure Arconic made a nice ticket off it, but I'm surprised they're able to get away with producing a material that's extremely flammable, especially when it's made for shelter. In the end, I still believe KCTMO should have done their due diligence in securing the proper housing material, but you would hope Arconic kind of would have tried to upsell them on some better material. Now we'll take a look at our class theory. The video we were required to watch in class, it involved a lecture that went into great detail about this theory. Again and again, he stated that high risk, low frequency is the most worrisome of this matrix above. High risk, high frequency are not planned for. I take that back. High risk, high frequency are planned for, and that's due to the frequency of the event. I mean, we see it happen again and again, so yes, we know that this event needs to be planned for. You take a look at your low risk and high frequency. Still, that event is occurring on a high frequency basis. We're prepared for it to happen again. The risk is low, but we still want to be ready for it. And the low risk, low frequency, I mean, these are events that we're not really looking out for too much. The risk is low, the frequency is low. We're going to put our resources into something else on this side of the table here. This upper quadrant that I've circled, high risk, low frequency. That kind of describes Grenfell perfectly. Then you put in the idea that there's no time to think it through on site. That's kind of creates a disaster. So although warnings were given, the owner did not believe the risk was able to happen. That's why it sits in this category. The incident could have been prevented. Step one, they shouldn't have allowed the manufacturer to make that type of cladding, and then two, the Grenfell shouldn't have considered cost to risk analysis. So these are the events we need to look out for. Those low frequencies are hard to come up with, but they need to be planned for, and they need to be planned for serious. Unfortunately, it takes an event like Grenfell to realize that we need to plan for events such as this. So here are my works cited. Thank you all very much for joining my presentation. I hope you learned something about Grenfell, and enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you.